Hey there, kiddos, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Uncle Frank, and that you are having a great day, and in today's video, I'm going to be sitting back in a chair that does not squeak, relaxing and having a little conversation with all of you guys about Pokemon, gambling, and government oversight. Because, yeah, earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, over on Discord, someone shared an article from the Japan Times titled something along the lines of Japan weighs regulating Pokemon cards amid trading mania. I think that was the title. And it was a very short article talking about recent concerns with the explosive growth that the Pokemon card market has experienced. Like 90% growth in 4 years is insane. And some concerns from people over in Japan about, things like money laundering and such tied to the Pokemon market. But basically, overall, the article was a nothing burger. No laws, at least through my perusing of the article, no laws were actually being proposed to regulate the Pokemon market over there or trading cards in general, because Japan has more than just Pokemon. They have Yu-Gi-Oh, Duel Masters, etc. So nothing was really being proposed in the article. But what if it were? What if tomorrow, say, the U.S. federal government, not Japan, not Germany, what if the U.S. federal government, what if Congress tomorrow passed an act that would see the trading card market, the very large trading card market? Remember, it's not just Pokemon, Magic, and Yu-Gi-Oh! It's all the other card games and all the sports cards and all the non-sports trading cards. It's a huge market. What if Congress passed a bill into law that would see that market treated the same way as the stock market, with regulation and new rules and standardized policies that you'd have to follow in order to participate in the market? What would happen? Now, before I continue, I want to make one thing very, very clear. And I know that you guys have never heard this from me before on the channel before, but everything in this video is my opinion. I'm not an economist. I'm not an econ major from the Institute of Ohio or wherever. I'm just a guy giving his opinion on the internet. So don't take this as gospel or anything. I'm just going to talk about what would happen, in my opinion. What if? First off, why might the U.S. government actually want to regulate the trading card market? I think that's a question that needs answered. And there's a few reasons, a few major ones and a few minor ones. Consumer protection is always the big one that people like to use when it comes to providing any kind of regulation to any kind of market. Standardizing things, especially with grading being as prolific as it is. A huge part of the trading card market is grading, and the grading market, which is a secondary market of a secondary market. Wild stuff. There could be a strong argument made that the grading submarket needs to be standardized, and authentication needs to be something that is trustworthy and reliable from company to company, that there's standards and practices put in place to make everything like that reliable and easy to double check, basically. So that's one thing. And that could result in things like PSA, for instance, getting a government contract. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? There's other financial reasons. Of course, the money laundering angle, tax evasion, especially when it comes to physical sales. Some trading cards have a very pretty price tag associated with them, and there's a lot, believe it or not. I know that this might be hard to accept, but a lot of expensive cards change hands in private backroom deals where cash in one hand and expensive card in another, or partial cash, partial trade, or whatever. And I know it's hard to believe, but the government doesn't like when you do that. They want to tax every little transaction, every little trade possible, so that they can get the most money out of any market. Honestly, this is not a card game thing. This is a market thing. The federal government loves its taxes. So obviously there's an angle there for them to shoot. There's a lot of untaxed potential in the trading card market. And then, of course, there's the protecting the children aspect with the whole way that trading cards are basically gambling. And that's not really much of a, it's not really a hard point to argue because, for all intents and purposes, randomized packs with random chances for rarer cards that are potentially worth hundreds or in some cases thousands of dollars on the secondary market. It's very easy, I think, for some member of Congress to argue that Pokemon cards basically are gambling, especially if you're buying the randomized packs. I mean, the argument basically works for loot boxes, and how different are card packs from loot boxes? Um, so if all that's taken into account, and other things, I know I'm forgetting other arguments that could easily be made, but if that's all taken into account and a law gets passed tomorrow, and the government says, hey, we are now putting our foot down, no more of this free, unregulated market. You now have rules in place that have to be followed, and I could not even begin to hazard a guess as to what those rules would be. Just imagine an entire thick book of rules that needs to be followed if you want to participate in the trading card market from now on. Either as a primary seller, as in you're the company that produces and sells the card game in question, or as a secondary market seller or a vendor, such as most card stores, for instance, or eBay sellers, or shit like that. You know, in my opinion, as more rules and regulations are put in place, and as more hoops need to be jumped through in order to make your business work, costs for that business will go up. And for larger stores in the trading card world, those hoops will largely be a non-issue. You know, larger businesses have their own legal teams, for instance, and they will have people who understand the tax policies and regulations very well, and they will have an entire chunk of their employee base dedicated to basically saying, this is everything that needs to happen, here's how we're going to do it, all that jazz. You know, especially the large trading card companies. You know, you bet your ass Wizards of the Coast, or Hasbro through Wizards of the Coast, you bet your ass that they have lawyers who will understand the legal code for the oversight within day one, basically. They'll go through the entire document, they'll know what to do, and they'll have no trouble. But as there are more regulations, as there's more hoops to jump through, costs for smaller stores and individual online sellers like myself will go up. It'll make it vastly more difficult to make a profit in the industry, especially if there's an entire subsection of rules that didn't exist yesterday that you'll have to now follow to the T, basically, if you want to continue being in business. And as those costs go up for the sellers, for the vendors, etc., especially for the grading card vendors, because this will almost certainly affect them. As those costs go up for the sellers on the secondary market, those costs are passed down to the end consumer. And I'm not talking about the investors. I'm talking about the collectors, the players, the casual fans of the card games. You can almost guarantee that investments, like, let's say, Pokemon cards, an investment getting more oversight naturally would make it harder and more expensive for that particular investment to move. You know, you can't just walk down the street and trade a stock to a friend by passing him a slip of paper and he goes on his merry way. Now he owns the stock and you own $5 or something. I don't know. You trade your Coca-Cola stock for a crisp can of Coke. That doesn't work. You know, there's rules and limits, and certain places you have to go online or in person to participate in that market. The same would be true if there was a lot of oversight for the trading card world. And naturally, it would make the trading card world much more difficult to navigate, much more expensive, especially for older cards as they get... an argument could very much be put in place that older cards need stronger regulation. Especially, I'm not talking about Yu-Gi-Oh cards or vintage Pokemon or vintage Magic. I'm talking about vintage sports cards. The ones that are basically so old and so scarce and so rare that they basically never move on the market for how pricey they are. You could see those disappear basically overnight as people get very cagey about the amount of money they'd end up having to pay or potentially lose by trading those cards. That's a very real thing that could happen. I'm not saying it would, but it could happen. But overall, I think, in my opinion, that government regulation of a secondary market for a game and a collectible would be almost certainly a bad thing. I think it would be taxing for the small businesses, taxing for the individual sellers, and devastating to collectors and fans and players of those games. You think building a Yu-Gi-Oh deck is hard now? Oh man. Imagine if every single reprint of Dark Armed Dragon was being monitored. And the government goes, sorry, you can't reprint that for X, Y, or Z reason. Crazy stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a worry that we actually have to think about too much. And that's because at the end of the day, when it comes to the government actually cracking down and, creating some kind of regulation for the trading card market, I think the prognosis is unlikely. Just because there's been talks about this before. Whenever there's a big boom in a collectibles market, any collectibles market, not just card games, any collectibles market, there's talks about regulation, oversight. Oh, think of the kids, think of the tax evasion, think of the counterfeits, all that jazz. Those conversations creep up every few years in different markets, all across the collectibles world. Okay? Time and time again. And you'll see that when the markets shift, when times change, when the bear market for these collectibles returns, conversation basically dies on its feet, because it's harder and harder to argue that you want to try to squeeze some tax money out of a market that's currently in its bear cycle, right? We've seen this before. For instance, there were talks about regulating sports cards in the 80s because there was a huge sports card boom in the 80s. In the early 90s, there was a massive comics boom, and there were talks back then about regulating comic books. Beanie Babies were a global phenomenon, and there were people saying, oh, well, we should have the government look into Beanie Babies. And what else was there? Oh, yeah, Pokemon. This happened before, 30 years ago with Pokemon. Some of you guys are too young to know this, but Pokemon's been around for a while. 30 years, in fact. And Pokemania, that's a very loud train. Pokemania, in the late 90s, was hectic. It was a fever dream, almost. And you can bet that there were government talks about, cracking down on Pokemon. Not the Pokemon market so much as things like, oh, we should have the government make rules for Pokemon in schools and stuff, because it's very disruptive to have your class of kids being absolute psychopaths over their Pikachus and their Charmanders. And I'm a fake Pokemon fan, so I can't name a third Pokemon. Mewtwo? Mewtwo. That sounds like a real Pokemon that a real Pokemon fan would know. But honestly, at the end of the day, we've had these discussions before. There's been talks of regulating collectibles markets and cracking down on individual sellers and small businesses and illicit trades for decades now. And I don't think it lasts. I don't think it's likely to pass a law or anything like that, just because it comes and goes at ups and downs, and the markets have a tendency to self-regulate almost cyclically, which is something we're seeing right now in the world of Pokemon, that game that I'm definitely not a fan of. So, overall, as a thought exercise, I think it would be a bad thing. Practically, I don't think it's something that could actually happen, and I don't think it's worth worrying about. So, at the end of the day, overall, I'm glad to say that we live in a world where I don't have to report to Agent Jackson that I sold this card. Why does this Force of Will card have a red back? I don't know the answer to that question. feel like I should. Anyway, that's all I got for you kiddos today. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below if you agree with me or disagree with me about any of my opinions I gave in this video. And of course, check out the Discord, the Patreon, the TCG player link, and eBay. All of those links are in the description below. Thank you guys for your attention. I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.